So we're going to take a look at some of these special conditions from equilibrium. And in the next couple of videos, we'll look at like fiscal policy and how we could move back to equilibrium. But this is the idea of going back to equilibrium, from a expansion or from a recession. And in fact, what we're going to learn in this video is that the economy can correct itself if we wait around long enough. Now, you've heard me harp in class probably about Keynes and saying that in the long run we're all dead, but his response was to this argument of theory that if you do wait around long enough, the economy can self-correct from an aggregate demand gap. And we're actually going to learn in this video how that's possible. So let's start out with drawing here a expansion and a recession. So we're going to start with first labeling the price level and output on both of these. Okay, so GDPR, or you can use Y, and PL. And we know that we're in an expansion, so we're going to start, we need LRAS, we always need that. And we're going to say YF for full employment. And we're going to do the same thing over here, LRAS with YF. But we are going to start in a recession and we're going to start in an expansion. So what does that mean? Well, the easiest way to think about these is actually to just draw your aggregate demand curve, right? Just go ahead and draw it where it's supposed to be, right? Like down kind of the middle, and then think about where is aggregate supply in this picture. If we're in an expansionary gap, that means Y1 is going to be somewhere over here. It's going to be over here, and we're going to actually move back to the equilibrium. And if we're in a recession, that means Y1 is going to be somewhere over here, and we're going to move back that way to full employment. So the problem will always start by telling you the economy is in one of three places, right? Three, not four. I can't raise my fingers. One is in equilibrium, two is in an expansion, and three is in a recession. So here we're going to start in an expansion. Now, in an expansion, Y1 is out here. So we're going to put our LRAS like that. Or sorry, SRAS like that. And that's a little wonky, right? But the idea is that we're going to say Y1 is out here. And with a recession, we know that actually Y1 is over here. And so our SRAS is going to be kind of off to the left. It's too low from this picture. Now, we don't know, from this where we started, but it does say from an aggregate demand change. And the mechanism that's going to correct is going to be short-run aggregate supply. So let me explain something a little bit here. In this scenario, we used to be where aggregate demand, right, was maybe here. And I drew it really tiny because we don't want to make too much of a mess. And up here is where we ended up. So we went from point A to point B. And what happened to price levels during that time from A to B? Right? Price levels went from PL1 to PL2, right there. So they went up with that AD expansionary gap. And if you're still like, wait, what happened? How did that happen? How did we get there? Look back, literally right there. Boom, right? So let's say AD expansionary gap, it's this picture right here. And so we see we went from PLE to PL1 going from A to B. So same picture, A to B. But we're just not drawing that full one. So now when this happens, the price levels went up. And one of the things that's going to start to happen in the long run, if nothing else in this economy changes, is inflationary expectations will increase. And if those increase, then SRAS, so we'll say therefore SRAS will decrease. Because workers will go to their bosses and say, boss, I need a raise. And suppliers will go to their intermediate goods suppliers will go to the final good manufacturers and say, you have to pay me more, baker, for the flour that you need. So if in time, the SRAS curve will actually shift back. SRAS. And we'll say that one's like SRAS2 or even something, some other number. And that's going to happen that we then move back to point C. Now, in that process, right, we just moved up in price levels again. Now, because we did that, we hit back to YF, it's just going to stop there. It's not going to keep going decreasing unless these inflationary expectations get out of control. And that is something that we often are concerned with in policymaking, is what are people's expectations about future inflation. But this mechanism of self-correction, that it will pull us back to YF, means that governments cannot be in the business of constantly moving us from, we'll say, AD0 to AD1. You can't constantly push us from A to B, and it comes at a cost if you do it. In the 1960s in the United States, the US government did that. We kept trying to push output from YF out to Y1. And we did that, and then there would be inflation. It would go up a little bit. And then policymakers would say, uh-oh, unemployment's rising, because obviously if you go from Y1 to YF, that's less output, so people started losing their jobs. And then the government would say, time to cut taxes, or time to have a new spending program. And it would push AD further out again, and then SRAS would shift back again. So this mechanism happened, and it pushed inflation higher and higher. So this self-correcting from an AD gap is when Keynes was remarking that yes, in the long run we're all dead, but this can happen actually relatively quickly if we're talking about an expansionary gap. Now let's talk about a recession. If you wait around long enough, right, in this one we're saying you actually decreased AD, so we'd say AD, we'll say 0 again to AD1. You went from A to B, right? You went from A to B. And if you're still like, wait a minute, how did we get there? How do we go from A to B? Well, let's go back. Recession caused by AD going down. That's like saying we went from A to B. And when that happened, price levels fell and output fell. And now in this one, we talked about how there's lots of ways you could fix it through increasing government spending or cutting taxes and things. But up here is the idea that the economy could, if you wait around long enough, correct itself. And here's what happens. Right? When we went from A to B, PL1 to PL2, price levels fell. And if you're still like, how did that happen? Go back, you fell. Price levels went down. Now, when those price levels went down, inflationary expectations went down, and therefore SRAS can increase. And in a real sense, input costs fell when this happened. It's not just inflationary expectations, but it also is the idea of actual input costs, right? Eventually, the input costs are going to go up in this picture on the left, and on the right, we're going to say input costs go down. The idea is that if you wait around long enough, a starving person will be willing to work for a really low wage. Now, Keynes's observation was that there actually kind of is a reluctance to cut wages. When they're in a deep recession, lots of employers don't cut wages because that really hurts morale. Think about it. If you had a factory of 20 people and you said, gee, I could either cut all of their wages and keep them all employed, or I could lay off 5 of them and keep the other 15's wages the same. A factory owner is going to actually lay off 5. And the reason is that it would increase the motivation to work for the remaining 15 because they go, oh, I got to step it up. But also it's a way for you to eliminate less productive workers, and it saves you the same amount of money. So you get the same monetary benefits, but you also motivate the remaining 15 workers. But eventually those 5 workers who got laid off will be willing to work for less wages. And Keynes's argument was that takes a really long time, so we shouldn't wait for it. But as these people begin to work for less wages, that reduces input costs. And then SRAS shifts back to the right. So SRAS will shift to the right, and we'll go to SRAS 2. Now I know that there's a lot of lines here, but just remember we're moving the SRAS curve, and we actually are going from B to point C. And you notice we went from A to B to C. Now we're back at the full employment level, but we're at a lower price level. And that actually is kind of the idea of what Herbert Hoover and the Republicans in Congress in the 1920s and 30s were saying was, if we wait around long enough, this will actually help us. It will pull inflation out of the economy, and the SRAS curve will shift back to the right. Now, they weren't using that language, right? They didn't have a concept of SRAS at that point, but that's the logic behind saying we should wait around. In the long run, it will correct itself. Now, these are 2 models that are useful for us to understand, and they really rely on the notion that input costs in the long run are flexible. Right? People's wages and prices for inputs are flexible in the long run, and that's what causes the movement back from B to C. So now we're going to wrap it all up by comparing all 3 of the models that we've talked about in this semester and show them together just really quick here. That you can show all 3 pictures, a PPC, a business cycle, and the ADAS model, all basically in the same spot. So we'll say PPC, so this would be consumer goods and capital goods, and then we'll say this one is output over time, and that's our PPC, or sorry, that's our business cycle. So we'll start by saying you have LRAS and YF, and you have AD and SRAS, right? SRAS. And that this is some equilibrium level of prices. You have a point here and a point here and a point here. Notice that the SRAS is kind of what's going to allow us to move along if there's an aggregate demand change. And then we'd say here, and we have trend and the actual, right? So the actual and then the potential. And so we would say that if you were at the full employment, we'll say point F, that's the same as being on a PPC, or it's like being right where the actual and the potential meet, F. And then if we said you're in an expansionary gap, maybe because of an AD shift, that would be an E here, and it would be a little temporary point beyond out here, or maybe a point beyond out here. And then this kind of a point down here, way low here, if we had AD that was in a recession, right, as opposed to AD in an expansion, and this is kind of like, imagine that you'd have the whole curve lined here. This point would be a recession, and so we'd say you have a recession, and you have a recession. So any points here, right, these are those recessions, these are those expansions. And so we'd say they tell us similar stories, each one of these. You're likely to see questions on an exam that ask you in particular to link this picture and this picture together, or to analyze what's going on with this sort of picture and link it to this one and this one. And to the implications, therefore, also of changes in price levels, right, if changes in price levels are happening. So this is a good connection to make mentally in your mind, and you will be asked to kind of link these two together. So hopefully you've taken some good notes both about self-correction and the way that SRAS and input costs being flexible in the long run, right? Flexible input costs being the changing mechanism here as to why SRAS happens. You are going to have an exam question that asks you exactly about this. How does the economy self-correct if there is no action taken? And it's going to ask you, why does SRAS increase from a recession? Well, it increases because of flexible input costs. You could say people are willing to work for lower wages or something like that, but this is definitely an important idea, especially for recessions. Okay, I'll see you next time.